And we will head on over to our slides for you guys. And you guys know, if you are new here or whether you've been here for a while, maybe you even know your type or your spouse's type, that the 1s, 2s, and 6s are culturally compliant types. And I added the word culturally compliant. For those who are wondering why I did that, something that is very important to me, words are very important to me. And when I hear the words compliant or dependent with the type, I get a little irritated because I know that a lot of 1s, 2s, and 6s have their own thoughts and opinions and feelings. And there are moments which can be very, like spouses, especially in marriage, can feel like they're 1, 2, or 6 and them are not agreeing on everything. And so I just want to first and foremost start with that misnomer to let people know that I think it's a beautiful term, and we'll talk about why. But first, if you're feeling like, man, we argue, or I'm a 6 and I have my own opinions and I go against the grain, you might wonder. But I also want to start to say that a lot of times people are culturally compliant, but not compliant in the marriage in this group as well. So it's important that you really take a look at yourself if you're married to one of these types or you have family of these types, and you may say, okay, they're not compliant with me, they're my sibling, they're my spouse, they're and actually I'm going to just welcome everybody. If you are able to mute your camera, that would be great, or your screen, and I'll come back and do that if you don't know how to do that. But also just really keep that in mind as we start out, that sometimes this 1, 2, and 6 are just like, hey, I can be compliant culturally, but not always in marriage. So let's talk about how to get along in marriage. I think that's why we're here, but it's not just for marriage, it's for all relationships. So first, let's talk about what's really cool about compliance. And that is that I love this Erik Erikson quote. You might know he's one of the most famous psychologists of all time, but very famous for education and for psychology itself. And he says, in the social jungle of human existence, there's no feeling of being alive without a sense of identity. So I think it's really beautiful that the compliant types 1, 2, and 6 know this, and that they'll go down with the ship if needed to help culturally people to do better socially. And that is beautiful. A lot of the time we hear in big social groups, whether political or religious or otherwise, just caring community groups for elders, children, animals, you name it, that there's a 1, 2, or a 6 in the lead. And so I'm going to come back for just making sure everybody's mute is on. Interestingly, I do think it is. I'm just going to mute everybody just because I can hear a little bit of background. Let's see. And also, there we go. Check the chat really quick. So anybody have, okay, yes, aggressive and assertive stance. So excited to talk about that one. So any questions so far, though, about the compliant stance, and maybe even any thoughts as I've shared that about cultural compliance versus marital compliance? Okay, let's keep going. Let's dig in. So, but let's start also with saying, yay, that these types really do a beautiful job socially. So what we know is that those who comply socially are responsible and dedicated, and they want to socially do what's expected. And like I said, what's best for others, even if it means sacrificing their own immediate wants or sometimes the wants of their family. And so this is important for you to hear, because there are so many nuances. And even if you're familiar with the Enneagram subtypes within Enneagram, to where this is not always true in the fullest of senses, that all compliant types don't all do the same thing, right? Some of them are like, no, my family is first before anything I do socially or compliantly culturally. But in general, this is a struggle, not because these groups of people are bad or wrong, just as we've talked about the other groups of the 4, 5, and 9, and next week we'll talk about the 3, 7, 8, but because these individuals really are just trying so hard to do what they believe is right. And so sometimes that can come just at their own expense because they put their family up there too. Or sometimes it could come as at the expense of a marriage as well. And I have seen it both ways in my work with couples. I have currently people that are of these that do a beautiful job in marriage, and they are just sort of have to pick themselves up a little bit because they forget themselves. They're so socially compliant and maritally compliant. Maybe they do everything for their kids too. But sometimes I do see that these types in marriage come in with the struggle of giving to the environment and then not being able to give at home as well. So that's something that if you're struggling with that, know that you're not alone and that we have good solutions and boundaries for you, because we really know this is part of life for so many people. And we really have a lot of ones, twos, and sixes. If you go into, like I said, one of the big organizations out there who is really serving the world beautifully, you're going to see it mostly run by ones, twos, and sixes in a lot of ways, not in all the ways, but in a lot of ways, because they're committed to their promises and they're very responsible and dutiful. And that's beautiful. Oh my gosh, every teacher, every leader needs these types. Now, just as another aside, these types can also have, the 1, 2, and 6 can have a hard time relaxing or playing because there's always work to do. And sometimes it's hard to rest, and it's really hard. Oh, let me come back to, whenever I get a call, sometimes it pops me out of the visual. Hold on here. You guys can probably still see the share, but I need to not take this call. Okay. Turning my phone off. Okay. Resume share. Thank you for your patience there. Making sure that they can also struggle, or making sure that they don't feel guilty. And so it's also important that, sometimes because there's such a giving nature in these types, this is a very subtle time for them to sometimes feel a little superior to others. But I really think it's important that once again, we notice that's not always the case. And I think it's so important for you guys to be aware. And as more come into the group, I can just say, we're talking about 1s, 2s, and 6s, and be aware that these trends are not just everybody. Everybody who's a 1, 2, or 6 doesn't always feel like they're better than others, doesn't feel like they're having to sacrifice their marriage. But just sometimes you should know these are some struggles these types can have is, I've got to do what's right for the culture or for the group. And so my family might have to take a back seat, or I might even feel a bit superior. And sometimes I like this about a 1, 2, or 6, they can seek advice from their conscience to determine the right thing to do. And that's beautiful because that means they're thinking. And it's interesting because sometimes these types can also be thinking inhibited. So when you see a 1, 2, or 6 saying, let me stop, let me pause before saying yes, and let me think, wow, that's a great space for a 1, 2, or a 6, for them to just say, I've got to think this through many levels, and thinking takes time. And even though I want, and my first thought here is relational, and I want to do what's right for the group, I want to see what's right for everybody, me as an individual, my family as a marriage, and as children, if you have children or extended family you take care of or are part of, and then of course, society too. But sometimes it can just be the opposite a little bit. So it's lovely when you can see this group really take those things into account first. And also just for you to know, like I said before, when a 1, 2, or 6 is in a group and there are rules and procedures, they do well, and they are tirelessly working, which is absolutely beautiful. Now, as I mentioned, being thinking inhibited, sometimes the inner guidance is hard for them. And so sometimes they really don't know what to do. And to compensate for that, they seek belief systems to help them with ambiguity and uncertainty. And it's good in a way, because we have thousands of years, if not more, to rely upon data. And we have a lot of history and historical documents to tell us and to learn from our predecessors and our peers around us. But it's also important that when a 1, 2, or 6, like I said, is looking for how to be in the world, that they can also look internally and stop for a bit. And as we're talking about couples today, I also want to say, maritally. So that way I'm going to stop this share here and we can come back and talk before we get into the one. But I just want to really highlight that for you guys, that if you're A1, 2, or 6 or with one, that it's important that you stop maritally to assess, not just individually, because we forget that sometimes in our NES speak. So anyone have thoughts or questions or want to fill in a little for us about the 1, 2, or 6? And I don't know if you want to say anything either, Jen, about intros.
So I don't have anything to add. I think you're doing a really fantastic job of covering everything. I am agreeing with everything as one. And welcome to those people who joined us. If you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we will get back to you. But we hope that you're enjoying this and we hope that you're getting something out of it today.
Yes, thank you so much, Jen. Jen is my awesome EA, and she's also a coach on our team. So if you have any questions for us, you can direct them to Jen, and you can make sure that you check out anything I'm talking about with her. And if you have a question that you want me to answer out, you can give that to Jen also. So I'll check with you in a little while, Jen, if there are any questions, but let's get into the 1, 2, and 6 specifically relationally now. Okay. Love to get to this part with you guys because we get to talk all relationships. Okay, so when you're with a 1 and you're wondering, how do I work with a 1? Well, first of all, we have even more nuanced guides if you ever need our deep dive guides or episodes, because we know that we can't say it all here today. But I also really like to give you a few tips to let you know that we've talked to hundreds and thousands of 1s and interviewed them here, which has been such a gift to us. And we've been able to partner with Trudy Psychometrics to be able to study 1s at large. So we know these tips are real and that they work really well. So try in general to set up a time to talk beforehand with a 1 if you want to talk about something important maritally, when they're not stressed and feeling like they're already in a million different directions with everybody in culture, and so that they feel prepared and rested enough. And another thing that you should know about 1s is sometimes they can feel like they need to set a boundary if they're like, I don't want to talk about this because it's unpleasant and I already have an inner critic that's difficult for me to work with. And so I just need to go to a fun place. And so you may need to say to that 1, this is an important conversation for you to have with me. Another thing you should know about that is that 1s struggle with the defense strategy of reaction formation. So sometimes they don't even really feel aware of their anger or frustration with you as a partner. And so they want and need and have things to say to you too, but they're kind of locked up, like I said, just kind of like, never mind, I'll do it myself. And then you see a tight jawed, clenched person or feel as though you're walking around on eggshells with them. So it's really important that you guys come together in a planned time when the 1 is not overly stressed and try to use logic when you're talking with a 1, because they're very logical and they will do well. They're good listeners. And also to the 1, if you're a 1 listening, make sure that you allow in bits of fun and emotion. And there are some 1s that feel like emotion's not healthy because we need to be logical only, or we might lose our crap, right? And so what's important is that 1s know that, of course, if you're over 100 beats a minute and you're truly escalated, highly escalated, that's not healthy. But for you to be emotional shows care. And so it's okay for you and your partner to have conflict. And I just want to say that for anyone listening on the recording or here with us, it is okay and healthy to have conflict. And if your children hear or see that, don't try to hide it. They can feel it too. Children are very perceptive, so perceptive. And so just let them know this is part of life and we're having some conflict. And hopefully you do most of that out of sight of kids, but not all of it, because I've seen a lot of people who said my parents never had any conflict and I never knew what to do, but I could feel it in the home. So just know that 1s, you are not bad or wrong if you have to talk through relationship issues and use a bit of emotion. But like I said, to both of you and your spouse, it's also okay to laugh. The #1 marriage researcher, John Gottman, reminds us laughter in marriage conflicts is like goals. And so there you go with your #goals. And I hope you can add in all three elements of logic, emotion, and fun. Now we'll fly through these others so we can come back and talk about ones, but just try not to judge each other for reacting and take breaks. If you've heard my podcast before, that we all care differently. So it doesn't mean your spouse doesn't care if they need a break, but don't take a break for too long. Try not to leave for a whole night or a storm away in a justified sort of rant and walk off. We call that the rat walk. We saw this in A League of Their Own, but my kids are always like doing this fake walk away, and it's like this stomping away. And so just try not to do that, but try to not take your rat walk, but just come back and love each other and say, I need a deep breath. I'm frustrated. I'm stressed. I'm human. Okay. That is so refreshing. And then lastly, these last few are figuring out the boundaries, of course, but I already hinted at that with all of our compliant types, so that your family comes first and that you come first, so that you guys are refreshed before you're giving out to others. This is your main tribe. And then also notice, of course, the resentments building up. And I want to hear if you have any ideas, but something that I was just chatting with a type 1 yesterday about that was, and I'll come back to you guys to share this, but life-changing for her was that she's actually a video I've done with her in the past as a previous client and an occasional client now, but she has shared this on her video and I'll share it here. 5 gratitudes every single morning for a 1 can do wonders, because there's such a sense of duty. And even right from the first part of the day, waking up and feeling the need and the guilt. I know my husband's a 1, and sometimes he wakes up with guilt, and sometimes the guilt is even with him through the night. And so it's paralyzing. But if you can allow the thoughts and that frontal cortex to take over a little bit and to take some deep breaths and to try to just start out with 5 gratitudes, it can really change you. And that was so beautiful for me to hear last night, is she's like, I'm a different person. I've gone through a catalyst, a metamorphosis, and I'm different now and I'm happier. And so I want to encourage you, if you're a 1 and you're struggling with joy, to find that gratitude every day, or any type, because let's be honest, we can all be high in the 1 space, even if we're not a 1, whether it be because maybe you have a wing or an arrow, or you share a group with them. Maybe you're another body type out there and you're like, yeah, I'm an 8 or a 9, but I have a lot of 1. So be aware that this tip can be for you too, even if that's not your type. Now, does anyone have any questions or comments about 1s, or want to add anything about 1s?
Krista, there is a great question here. If I could read it to you, maybe you want to respond to it. How can we encourage gratitude for a 1 while still helping them to feel like we take their view of what's wrong in the world seriously?
Wow. What a great question. Oh my gosh, you guys, this community makes me happy because we can dig deeper this way. And that is really important that you mentioned that, because 1s really do well on a walk and talk to verbally process, as do the other compliant types. So make sure that you take some time walking with them if they're interested, or just sitting if they prefer, but where the 2 of you do let them vent and get out some of the stuff. And if you just are in a space where you can't do that and they're willing, you could also say to the 1, or if you're the 1, hey, can you do some journaling? I think this would be a great point for you to just do some morning pages and for you to jot these down and then even rip it up. But you need to get this out, and I can't hear it right now. But hopefully you can, because I think that's extremely valuable for our compliant dependent types, is they truly do better socially. Like, it truly is hard for them. I know, at least for my husband, when I withdraw for too long, it's scary, because he's like, he knows humans thrive socially. So try not to leave in those moments, but try to stay and hang in. And you can say, I want to give this internally, you can say about 5 minutes or 10 minutes, but then it's okay to say, I've really hit my limit, if you have, and you set your boundaries too. But you might find that after the 5 or 10 minutes of this walk and talk, or your 1 venting out their stresses with you or the world, that they are feeling a lot better. And a lot of times 1's inner critic, as you probably know, is so much harsher than the one they're presenting to you. So you can also hear it in the lens of, I'm not trying to be mean to you, I'm just tired and exhausted. So here's what would help me. And please know that 1s do have the gift of making the world a better place. So they're like, if I see something we could do better as a couple, or that I think you could do better at, please know that I mean it for good. But then you can also say this to your spouse, like, maybe you don't want to do gratitudes, but if you can show me appreciation more, pair it with your critique or sandwich your critique in between. You might have also heard this week's podcast that talks about it. So those are my tips for you dealing with the one. You're welcome. Okay. Anybody else have a thought or question about a one?
Chris, if I could just add one thing to what you just said and maybe give her a little bit more insight. As a one, I feel as though if I'm feeling maybe ungrateful or don't have a good perspective right now, and I want to do gratitude, but maybe I'm not in the right headspace, it's probably because I need some movement and I need to work it out. So the walk and talk's a great idea, but maybe encouraging him to do some body work to get some movement out, and then asking if there's anything that's triggering some anxiety within the house. So I know for me, in order to be able to like start work and sit down and to do all the things that I need to do, my house needs to be tidy and I need to have things done. So that might be another triggering thing for him, and he may not even realize it. But for a lot of even ones and sixes, it seems as though there needs to be a nice, clean, organized space. And it really can help to decrease their anxiety, especially if they're coming home from a busy day at work, being social out in the world. So just some added thoughts. And Courtney, please message me if you have any more questions. I'd be happy to help you.
Thank you, Jen. That was perfect. And that is such a great reminder. And hopefully your one will do some body work. And I love that tip about the 5 senses. Oh my goodness. And that 6s can share that too. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about our 2s. And we know with 2s that there's also a lot of care there. And feel free to put your 2s questions or comments in the Zoom chat as well. But try with a 2 if you want to work with them healthily in a relationship to talk before they get moving for the day. You might have heard Suzanne Stabile say this and other 2s on their podcast. Boy, it's fun to have people of each type so that you guys can help us to know what really helps you. And that's one of the things that helps a 2 is before the wheels are turning, that you get them moving. But sometimes that's hard to do. I was noticing a 2 for our workout class this morning, and she was teaching a 5:30 a.m. class and then teaching students in the middle of the day. And then she was coming through the whole day and still teaching at 7 to 8 at night. And I was like, oh my gosh, this 2 is on fire and she's going to be giving so well. But I want you guys to know that it might be a challenge sometimes to get to a 2 before the day starts going. So I realize that these tips are nuanced and you'll have to work them out together and see, when can I get them quiet and allowing them to have some time to think their classic important thought, which is, what is theirs to do today? And they need to factor in what is theirs to do that nobody else can do, and what is theirs to do that won't interfere with their own family and their own marriage. And understand that there are couples where one of the spouses might need only to see them every now and again. I know a 5-2 pairing that I work closely with said, hey, I don't mind if my 2 wife leaves for the whole day because we love each other and we're so deeply attached, but I like my space. So it's okay with some partners if the 2 is busy and active. And what you guys have to pay attention to is your marriage. You need to just really not look around at other people's marriages, because people are so diverse and each person has their own brain chemistry, body chemistry, heart chemistry, past. So looking at all of their own unique nuances will help you to figure out when your 2 could and probably should be doing. And you guys can figure that out together. Now, if you're a 2 listening, what I think is really important, and Enneagram work doesn't always get specific with the spirituality, but it always does encompass spirituality of some sort, where we release to God that even givers need breaks, and that even as powerful as we might feel in our gift of giving as 2s, that God can use other people, and that God does use other people, and that we're all equally beloved. And so sometimes you see 2s who struggle with feeling like they're better or worse than others, and like, I'm needed and God can't do it without me, or I'm nobody and everything is in this dependent, compliant cultural stance, dependent on what other people think and feel. So another practice for 2s ongoing is to build their own affirmations up. And so in that waiting, You can be building yourself up with affirmations. I'm beloved and I am not worse than others if I don't serve. I'm just human and that I'm making room for other people. But it's also important to take that deep breath while you do that, because that's not something twos are usually raised with or familiar with. Now, of course, when spouses are trying to help a two to do their work, it's important that they don't come from a cold space or overly logical, just like I said with the ones, because the two is a warm person generally, and twos need to know there's a lot of together time and that they are not going to be abandoned, which is an issue for twos, rejection and abandonment, if you have to set a boundary with them. And maybe even with them where you're saying, look, I want more time with you, but our issue seems to be that when anyone asks you anything, you say yes. And so you're thinking, I don't want time with you. But the truth is, there isn't much left when you come home, or maybe a two isn't in a good space because they have given all day and all night, and now there's almost nothing left. And so their spouse isn't really getting much help from them. So watch out if you're a two for where the giving is going. And it doesn't mean that you become one of those couples that only gives to each other. I think we've all heard about these couples, seen them, they're overly in their sexual subtype. Maybe we've even been there at times in our lives because we're all growing all the time. But it's important that if we're in that space of overly giving to our spouse, that we also understand this is a balance too, and give out from the gifts you've been given. Now, I want to hear other ideas or thoughts. I know we have some twos here, and I want to make space for that and see if there's any thoughts or questions about that.
Hey, Krista, this is
Mhm.
Sarah. I, I'm a number two, and recently I found it really empowering to recognize that sadness is a part of my vibe, and that
Mhm.
it's okay to go there and be with it without judging it, and to
Mhm.
also remember that it will flow through. That I'm not going to get stuck in the valley, and I
Yeah.
don't have to be stuck at the mountaintop, but I can flow in between. I think a lot of people don't recognize that. I work with a lot of twos, and some go through these depression cycles and they feel like something is wrong with me. And it's like, there's some brilliance wrapped around understanding that that's a part of your personality type. And so, how
Mhm.
empower our clients that are number twos to be able to move through those times of depression and sadness so that they can see that it's not all or nothing, because I can relate to that too. You know, it's like I can do everything and then I can do nothing. So I think it's really great for people to understand that this is a part of their personality type, that you don't have to label yourself as depressed.
Mhm.
Um, that we have to be really careful with how we label ourselves, how we identify our emotions, that our emotions can pass through us. They don't have to stay with us and
Mhm.
define us in that capacity.
Hmm. That is brilliant. I'm so glad. And I know you've been learning so much. And it's such a gift to us to hear you say that. I don't think there's anything like learning from somebody of the exact type, honestly, because you're inside of it in a way that nobody else can fully understand. So thank you. And I also think like even those of us not inside the type can do great work because we can hear that from you to hear, oh, wow, if you don't give permission for a two to not just identify with shame, but sadness, that they might feel like they're bad or wrong for experiencing it, or feel like they'll be stuck there forever, or that depression isn't a part of most people's lives and they must always be happy and bubbly. So thank you for giving twos permission to be normal and to not always be the hype girl. I think that's a cultural term that we're throwing around a lot with the twos and sevens and such. And it's really important to know that there's a space and time for that, but that twos are humans and they have access to all the emotions just like everybody else. And I'm glad it's blessed you so much to hear that for yourself. That's awesome. Another thing we can remind twos in marriage of is the boundaries with others outside of the marriage can be a sticking point for twos as well, because twos have a heart where they can feel, I don't know if a lot of you guys know this, probably a lot of you do, they can feel other people's emotion. So sometimes the boundaries aren't just with friends that they need to set, but sometimes they're even with people of the opposite gender, because, or somebody they're attracted to, same gender, but somebody else that they're giving their affections to in a way that is excessive to the spouse. And so what matters is your marriage and your spouse, but also just having a good ethic too, because I've known a lot of people who they are like fine with having an opposite sex friendship or somebody they're attracted to, and their spouse is even okay with it. But now the other person is feeling some vibes that neither them or their spouse expected. So it can hurt another family, even without the two and their spouse recognizing it, or without the two, if the two is putting the feelers out for what's socially going on here, such a gift for them. But if they're overly dependent on what these others think of them or feel. So just be aware, this is not yours to do if you're a two who's struggling with that. And you can help your two friends with this. If this is something you're like, no, I know this, and I want to help my two friends, because there's a lot of twos out there, especially two females. There's even a lot of two males, but there's a lot more two females than males. So you can share this with people. This is not necessarily yours to do, and you might even be taking away somebody else's opportunity. I had spouses dealing with that this week with affairs of just, wait, this isn't yours to do. And you're also, this is, blocking this other person from dealing with this with their spouse, or getting counseling with their spouse, or dealing with it with their, with God. So it really helps a two to hear, like, not only does it help your marriage and their marriage, but it also gives you a little bit of your precious time back, because you're a busy two, and feeling everybody's feelings can be exhausting. And as we heard Sarah allude to earlier, can make you unable to even deal with your own stuff because you're so busy helping others. And you matter too. You're important too. And your feelings deserve time to process. So that's going to be a gift back to you, is just to take that deep breath and enjoy your own processing through feelings. And you've heard Jen and me say today in the notes, here are some ways you can move through the emotion so that you don't feel stuck there. All right. So there's one comment in the notes. I just want to say Jen beautifully answered about the 2CL, about the one, or I don't know if it was a one, but you did a beautiful job on that one, Jen. So I don't feel like I need to review that. Any other questions about twos or anything like twos before we move on to sixes? Okay, and we can come back to that at the end. We're making beautiful time today. So with anything with one or two, if you're thinking about it later, yeah, we can come back. And also we have a great 6 episode for you out today. If you're thinking about, wait, I want to really get inside of a 6 even more. Oh my gosh, Heather goes so deep into 6 today. And that's why I picked her, because I knew she was such a strong 6. And even though 6s sometimes doubt if they're 6s, oh my gosh, she's the 6iest 6. And it's awesome to hear the insides. But relationships with a 6, there's a lot we can learn. And as I said before, if you're not into our deep dives or haven't done our episodes, you can get even more there. But if you're a 6 and you're in a relationship, it's so important for you to do your own thinking. Just as we said with 1s and 2s being thinking inhibited, it's so healthy and helpful for 6s to resist the urge to ask others what to do directly. And by the way, sometimes we love being asked by a 6 what to do, because 6s can be so charming and so fun and so sweet and so attractive. And so we're just longing to help them. Like, oh my gosh, maybe, if I give them this advice, it doesn't mean you can't give a 6 advice. It just means if you're the spouse of a 6, or if you're the friend of a 6, even better is letting them verbally process, because often while they're verbally processing, they're actually thinking it out right then. Or even while sometimes they're disagreeing with you, they're speaking out to see, do I really disagree with them? So there's a lot going on always in every possible second for a 6. But you also see my tip here under the first bullet point that they can write a pro and con list and talk it over with their spouse after they've done some thinking too. So you can also say, hey, I know we have a lot going on, and I know you need some time to think. So before you ask me what to do, why don't you write something out? Why don't you really plan for yourself what you're thinking about, and then we can talk together. Now, if you're a witty kind of couple like Heather explains on the podcast today, she's married with a 7, they love asking questions all day long together. And I know my daughter was echoing that when she's taught by Heather's husband. He's a voice teacher. And she said, how was your day today recently? And he said, it was good, but my wife and I spent like half the day just asking really witty questions to each other. So you guys also, if you're doing this together, may need some boundaries around that. But I thought that was just, he was having fun with it. So you might love it. Okay, so don't rush a 6 if you're in a relationship with one, or if you've got a strong 6 wing, you can tell your spouse this about you. Maybe you have a 6 in your tri-type. Don't rush them to make a decision, and don't surprise them with anything negative. And I honestly think you're probably thinking, why would I surprise somebody with something negative? But I've actually had my husband do this to me before as a 1, where he's thinking, okay, I know she has a 6 wing, and I know she won't like talking about this. So I'm not going to tell her. And that's not the thing to do until the end. With a 5, 6, or 7, you don't want to surprise them on plans that are hard, because they need time to think and to prepare mentally, and to make sure they have enough physical energy, because these types, even as much as they're dependent and compliant, like the 1 and the 2, they're not body or heart types, they're head types. So they need to be able to make sure that they can meet you in their body when they're supposed to. So I already mentioned the journal, but I also want to just say sometimes for a 6, it's really hard to be on their own. So if they can't do it, A, that's okay to be on their own to process. But B, you could say even just for 2 minutes. And I have a son who's very 6-ish, and I know how hard it is. And also Wes has a 6 in his own tri-type. So both of my men in my family don't like almost any time alone. And so I would never really say like, you need an hour to yourself, because that would be painful for them. But even just a couple minutes can really help. And I also set my son out every single day. He does a spiritual study in the morning in his Bible app on his iPad in the living room. And then he takes some time to just, like I said, 1 to 2 minutes to write out a response and to take some time to listen. But keep it short, keep it sweet. And hopefully there's, as a doubting thinking type, sometimes this type does not want a spiritual life, and I would never force anyone to have one. But because the thinking types have so much fear, faith is such a gift to them, and it's so wonderful. And I was even reading it this morning in my Lenten devotional, and I heard about how Thomas, you might have heard Doubting Thomas culturally, was running up to Jesus and saying, like, let's go with him. If Lazarus has died, let's be part of this whole entourage, and we'll die with Jesus if we need to. And I thought, for all the flack we give 6s in culture about their lack of faith, look at this 6-ish person running up to die with the flock if needed. So really want to just highlight that sometimes you might be annoyed with a 6 for all the time and attention they need, but I don't think you'll find a more loyal type, even amidst their doubts and questions. So let the doubts and questions be part of them. That's who they are. And then also, if they need to really put a cap on some of their worry when it becomes excessive, it's helpful to say, you have a specific time of day that you can plan for worry. And that way you're not going to betray your worry. Just like we say to the type 4, you're not going to betray your depths and your laments. And you can always know that your laments will be there for you. So we say to a 6, come on back to that worry later. But right now it's time to get moving or shower or relax or something else, so that the marriage doesn't have an excessive amount of chit chat about this. And I'm going to give you a chance to share ideas. for a 6 briefly. So let's talk about that, whether you have any comments or questions. As you're thinking that up, lastly, I'll just say during COVID, I had a 6 say to me, I said, how about we put that boundary around your worry? And that was really hard for them. They said, I need about 2 hours a day at least to talk to my spouse about my worries. And it really showed me what COVID did culturally to 6s. So it helped me to get inside of what it might be like to be a 6, but it also helped me to see how desperate their spouse might be feeling for some release. So I hope that you can hear that and try to balance that it's hard to be on the receiving end of a constant barrage of negativity. Even though we know that 6s bring in a lot of good points and do a lot of good planning from a negative space, because we can't always be positive. So they're like, hey, I need to troubleshoot. I need to figure out what we do if it all hits the fan. But you need boundaries around that. So I just wanted to remind you both of that if you're a 6 or with a 6, that you guys find a middle ground. And as I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about the 2s, every couple will be different. And as you heard me say even earlier in our 6 chat, some spouses will want to do this all day. They will. But your marriage has specific gifts. So line up with your marriage gifts. And if your spouse is the one who says, I can only do this for 10 minutes, try to see that as, okay, we balance and we're going to gift each other with these depths. Any comments or questions about 6? Aw, I love that you guys are sharing in the comments. This is great. And I love how that HSP, topic, the highly sensitive person, is coming out more as a category that people can talk about. So that's great. But any thoughts also about 1 or 2 that you want to share about here are welcome, because I know that this is a space where somebody might be asking or wondering, what does it mean to be compliant or dependent? Or can you tell me more about one of these types in their depths? And I really would be happy to help you with that. While you're thinking up questions, I'll let you know that we have our Enneagram and Marriage Facebook group. That is really cool place to learn. And Jen has been so faithful to give us weekly reminders of what we have going on for E&M, and also encouragements through the week to just remind us at the weekend to note that it's a weekend when we get stuck in our heads, or our bodies, or our hearts, to also just remind us of podcast episodes that are coming up. She keeps me where I'm supposed to be when I'm moving too fast forward. I'm like, oh yeah, that podcast was today. So it's really helpful to have Jen really organizing. And that's her one gift over there. And then we also have Instagram, which has been a wonderful place to really just talk with you guys and share thoughts in the DMs and hear your thoughts in the posting and in the stories. Sometimes my husband and I post our silly grocery store one. This week was hilarious for us to make. And if you ever just need a laugh, you can find our reels. But definitely want to say that we're going through a series of depths right now, because we know Enneagram work can be hard and it can be overwhelming. And so, really wanted this moment in our Instagram community to be a space of just like pouring into you guys and making you feel seen and heard and loved exactly as you are. Because I know that's so important when we can be negative with Enneagram. And then the collective opens in April. If you just need more regular care and you want monthly meetings like this on a regular basis, we love to have these every single month where we chat about topics in marriage, and we have a chance for people to share a bit more personally about their own marriages. And we have extra podcasts every single week for this group too, where we deep dive together. So, but I definitely want to hear from you if there's anything before we close out of questions or comments. And if Jen, you want to read that one, that would be great.
Sure. So we have a good question here. How do you navigate conversations between a 1 who tends to challenge rules, probably an SX subtype, and a 6 who tends to automatically gravitate towards rules and respect authorities and systems more than the 1?
So I think that that's a great question. And when you have a sexual 1, for those who are kind of wondering what is that, and I think probably most of you have heard us talk a little bit about that, but it's as Jen said, and as Courtney says here, somebody who's gravitating towards, just this one-to-one is more important than any rules. And so it's almost like, even though they're a 1, like the 6, they're not as culturally compliant. So I think that that's beautiful to be able to say, there are going to be nuances within these groups, and we might need to treat it as though that sexual 1 was more on the aggressive and assertive stance, because they're very 8-like. So in those moments, you would say, okay, I realize that I can come on too strong at times, but this is my powerful stance, and I'm very relational, and I bring this to our marriage. I'm saying that because I know as a 1, sexual 1 has a small tendencies, not huge, but small tendencies to sometimes wonder, am I good? And is this okay that I'm like this? And I just want to affirm, you are good and it is okay. And I also hear this a lot from 8s, like, I can't help being powerful and strong and passionate. So I don't want you to feel like that's bad or wrong, but I want you to understand that people need that to be dosed, especially when you have a 6 who's aware of everything. And if that's you as the 6, understand that you also have to realize that your partner can't just become somebody else. That's how they're wired. And so for you to really say, okay, you know what? Like, I know I would like to do everything that the culture says of me, but probably what's best is that we balance together. And I know that's a hard word for some people because it feels like a betrayal. And like somebody who recently wanted to come on our podcast said they hate the word compromise and balance. And I thought, I don't like it either, but it's part of life. We can't always have our way. And so it's important that both of you learn to lean in, and love takes sacrifice, and it's hard. It's nail biting. It's white knuckling, but that's why we're here for each other. So we can celebrate when you do it, when you're like, I leaned in a little bit, and we're like, oh my gosh, that's great. Because I know you didn't want to. I know you want to do everything the culture said, or something else, that your planning orientation said. Or I know you were so passionate and you wanted to just lean into the full, but just watching you grow is extremely rewarding for your children, for yourself years later, when you can see the way your spouse has rubbed off on you with their gifts. It's much harder to just force a spouse to change. So that's where I'm going to lead with that. And then there's another question there too, if you want to read it, Jen.
Of course. So do 1, 2, 6s act more compliant dependent when in stress? Do we end up acting like our stress types, or is this irrelevant?
Oh, that's a great question. And I wish it was like a cookie cutter answer, because I do think it's nuanced. But I think that in general, you are going to find that the first go-to is to be more compliant and dependent when in stress, because there's a stability in leaning into what we're comfortable with. And there just is so much comfort, right? And the 1s and 2s here, I see some nods of, yeah, that's an easy space to go to, is like, this is what feels right. And it feels good and it feels responsible. And I can, get social rewards too. I mean, you guys aren't saying that, but that just fits for me when I perceive that, like, that's a healthy place. But it can lean out so far that, once again, we're talking about, it could miss the real needs inside of the marriage and the family unit. And I've seen too many people have a divorce situation because they're like, oh my gosh, like we got stressed. And instead of leaning in, I leaned out. And I'm really grateful that after many, many years of our marriage, my spouse in this type has been able to see that. And he's willing to, as I was sharing with Jen this week, lean in all the way to me. But what I've learned is, don't lean in all the way. You need a balance. I don't want you to leave your responsibilities and duties, because that's a beautiful part of you. So we have to be good stewards when our spouse starts to do the change, and understand that this group in particular, because they're compliant, if you get them in the marriage now agreeing with you, they may lean too far. So just kind of work together to say, like, I would never want to hold you as my slave or as my captive because you're very good socially. And that takes a lot of responsibility, because there are spouses who would say, I want to be all sexual subtype, and I want to dominate you, and I want all of you. And we all have to work together to say, let's try to not take more than we actually need. And some of this, I know you're probably grabbing within the chats yourselves, but can you read that next question, Jen?
Yes, of course. What do 1s need to hear when they're very much in a 4 space? Do they just need listening? And I know my 1 husband does not need problem solving in those moments, which is my go-to, but what types of statements are helpful for them?
Jen, you might even have something to add about this too, because you and I have talked a lot about the 1 and the 4 space. I'll
Yeah.
just start with saying though that they need to know that they are safe there. And I think you're probably pretty good about helping with that as a 5-wing 6. I think that, of course, with the 5-wing 6 stuff, you could maybe lean out sometimes on emotions. So it's okay to say, I'm going to have to challenge myself to take a few deep breaths and lean in here to listen and truly be here. But I also just want to add that I think that because it's an uncomfortable space for a lot of ones, just really encouraging them, this is okay, this is normal, and you will get through. And then following it up with some doing might be helpful. But what would you say, Jen?
It's funny because we talked about this a couple weeks ago. I have a 1, 4, 7 in my tri-type, but I also tend to go to 4 and 7 a lot. And 4 is pretty uncomfortable for me. And when I get there, I feel like I'm stuck there. And so what I tell my spouse, and I even tell my friends, is I say, I just need you to listen. And so just listening is really good, but then also reassuring them that they will get out of this space. They're not going to be there forever. And sometimes it's cathartic to do something. I put that in quotes to help to get the emotion out. So for me, part of it was like, okay, maybe I need to put a sad movie on so I can cry to release the emotion. Maybe I need to do some slower body work that helps me to work through it. And to get out of this space. And then for me, I like to also move from 4 to 7. And so for me, that looks like, how can I have a little bit more fun? How can I be a little carefree, maybe even spontaneous? And it's okay for me to do that. That's the other thing that I sometimes need to be told, that all of my activities as a 1 and my chores and all the things that I have to do can wait, because I need to go through this process of first going to my 4 and then going to my 7. And so I think it's kind of a little hand holding as he walks through it. And I hope that's helpful. But also, the last thing I was going to say is the movement. It's so important. If I get in a 4 space, I might be stuck there and I move around in some way, I can usually kind of shake it off. And one thing that you told me, Krista, was the gratitude and the self-care. When I'm in a 4 space, is move to gratitude and try self-care practices. And that has seemed to be effective. And I'm getting more comfortable in my 4 space too. So that's maybe reassuring.
Yeah, that's so good. And I love how you're telling people it's okay to coach your spouse if they're in this stance and they're not used to moving out of it. Like some of the other stances don't want as much coaching, but this one doesn't mind. Gentle, not like a fix, like you said, just let me vent and talk out my problems, not fixing the problems, but the overarching, it's okay to have problems. It's okay to not do. It's okay to say no socially. Like they not only need to know this themselves, but they need some coaching to hear that from you. And when they want to do it, I also want to encourage the 1s, 2s, and 6s here to voice for themselves. And this is going to lead into Michelle's question, but can you read Michelle's question, Jen?
Yeah, of course. And just remember to tell your 1, I've actually been voicing this to my husband, tell me that I'm right and good, and don't criticize me, especially when I'm in the 4 space. And if you can remember that, that is the main motivation of a 1, then everything else will flow a lot easier. So Michelle asks, as a compliant 6 for the last 10 years, how can I ask my husband as an 8 to accept that I need space to be with me, to be me with my interests? And how soon will I overdo it? Will I overdo it?
Yes. And maybe she can clarify that last piece, because I had the same question about overdoing. But Michelle, it's a great question. And I'm proud of you. Like it gave me chills to hear that and to read that in the sense of, man, that's an awesome, beautiful, bold move for a 6, because anyone with an 8 can really struggle with, like I said, the passion. It's strong, it's big. And so I'm proud of you for knowing it. Heather's episode talks about it today. So first listen to Heather's episode on type 6, because she really does need her alone time. So that will just encourage you. There are 6s out there who have learned over a couple decades of really adulting and processing, as we know 6s will do, that, yeah, you need it and you can claim it. But when you have that 8 partner who may not get it, we really want to make sure your 8 partner knows that you love them and that you're there for them, because 8s feel a lot of power and energy, and they want to know they feel that from you too. So first and foremost, show up for your 8. Don't just show up with your worries and laments all the time. Show up in loyal, beautiful ways that I hope and believe you probably do as a 6. But just because I know 6s can get lost in the worry, make sure you're regularly showing your 8 a lot of love every day. And when I say a lot, it's going to be per couple. For some, 10 minutes a day is a lot, for others, an hour. But if it's becoming this kind of sexual subtype overtone of I need all your time, which can happen with an 8, it's really important that you set your boundaries. And that's going to take some very deep breaths and some very strong conversations. But I believe 6s are one of the most strong types. So I believe you can do that, and that your 8 will respect you and feel safe if you can balance that out together.
Yeah, the part about the overdoing was more the question of like, when will I take too much, or when will I be asking for too much? I mean, in a way, I don't really think that I will right away, you know, especially he's the man and I'm the lady, and I don't want to do, like demand too much.
Okay.
My own space or time, like my interests, like spending time on my interests instead of just doing all the things that I need for the house and the children and him and, you know, that world. And then I would like to have a little space for, I'm taking more space for myself just because I'm learning that I need it, and I have to ask it as a 6. I have to ask for it, which he's not just going to give it to me without me asking for it. Right.
Which there's a lot of types that are like that. And you're just saying, that's my hubby's type. He's not going to give it unless I ask. And as a 6, I'm a dependent compliant type. I'm going to ask. As a female, culturally, you're feeling that traditional role of, I want to be honoring to my person who's different from me. And some husbands are withdrawing and they wouldn't care. So it's different. And I want to say, in your particular case, what we say to 9s, and 6s have a strong 9 leaning as well, is we say 30 minutes to 2 hours a day. I've even said upwards of time there, just in the sense of if you guys can enjoy quality time together. You might even say, let me lean into you to find out what, maybe we can test this out a bit too. What could we do together that I actually really love? Because the recommended Goldilocks time of 3.5 hours a day doesn't mean 3.5 hours of time alone. But that's when human beings really do feel like, okay, I worked for most of the day, but for these 3.5 hours, something felt relaxing and good. And it was a reset for my spirit. So just tell him, like, that's the human experience. Which of that time frame could we do together? And then, is there a piece that I can have on my own, because this is really fulfilling to me, and I actually believe I'll be a better spouse to you if I can have that. And I think that if you hear a no, that you need to keep pushing, because you know you need it. But definitely come into it with a sense of partnership. It's okay to say to your spouse, do you mind, or can I? Because we have to admit we're partners, and sometimes we need somebody to watch a baby or something. We don't just demand. But ultimately, I do want you to assert, I do need a little time for my book or my bathing or my studies, whatever it is. And like I said, on your own, 30 minutes to 2 hours is pretty average. Does that seem like it would work for you?
Yeah, that probably is. Now that my children are gone to school, it's a lot easier to find that kind of time, you know?
Good. Oh, I love that. Well, if there's any more questions, I have another minute or two, and then I need to head out. But anybody have any thoughts or questions about this chat? I've really enjoyed it with you guys. Oh. Okay, well, thank you so much for being here. Next week, we're going to have the same time, same place to talk about the 3, 7, and 8 in more depth. So if you've got a spouse in that group, come on back. Or if you're in that group, come on back. We'd love to have you. Or even if you just want to learn about those types. Thank you. And thank you so much, Courtney and Michelle and Jen and everybody here. Thank you so much for being here, Sarah and Tessa and Kathleen and anybody else that I missed. But anyway, so good to see you.